right, we're going to move on to part 2 of chapter 1. We're going to start off by going over what white-collar crime historically has been focused on. In the 1970s, people started to pay more attention to white-collar crime. Society no longer trusted the establishment because of Watergate and the problems with the Vietnam War. You have to remember that in the 1970s, the early 1970s, society was changing rapidly. There are a few issues that are not relevant for this class, but you had changes in birth control laws, so men and women could access birth control more easily. The voting age was dropped to 18, so you could also have younger generations helping make policy in this country by voting certain politicians in. And lastly, you had the end of the Vietnam War hitting. And Vietnam had been one of those news stories that had been on the news for so many years. And we just kept getting in deeper and deeper. More and more young men were dying. And really what we were seeing was a whole lot of nothing being accomplished. So you had a lot of people who just did not feel good about the way that the establishment was being run. A lot of these folks became what is known as moral entrepreneurs in the form of investigating journalists, politicians, federal prosecutors, and they raised the public's consciousness about white-collar crime. Specifically, the Watergate was a huge issue. Can you imagine today finding out that President Obama arranged to have burglars break into the Republican National Committee office to steal information? Nowadays, that's just considered child's play. We would want to, of course, go in through their computer system, which, trust me, absolutely happens. Then we move into the 1990s. By the 90s, most of the public outrage had subsided as President Clinton came into office in 1992. Now, just to back up for a few minutes, through the 1980s, we had as our president Ronald Reagan, and then in 1988, his vice president George Herbert Bush took over. So what we saw in the 80s was a time of great growth, great financial success, but we also saw our national debt skyrocketing. One of the big issues that continues to be debated to this day is that Ronald Reagan increased spending for defense, but he didn't raise taxes. And what you saw there was our national debt going so far out of even comprehension because we weren't using any money to offset the increased spending. Now, in 1991, 1992, when President Clinton was elected to office, he had been immersed in a lot of scandal himself, and not all of them were based on sexual indiscretions. There were quite a few issues going on with land deals and with what we would call white-collar crime, embezzlement scandals. Now, of course, none of this was ever actually proven, but there were enough implications that it makes sense that he did not really have any interest in pursuing white-collar crime. And as a consequence to that, the federal prosecutors, the people who are supposed to go after white-collar criminals, the people he appointed to those jobs were not really interested in going after them. In the 2000s, George W. Bush became president, and he was unapologetically pro-business, meaning that he would often overlook any potential laws or laws that were already on the books if they were an impediment to business success. One of the big issues there is something that we're dealing with in Pennsylvania right now is natural resources. So when you have, for example, natural gas, which is exactly the issue in Pennsylvania right now, is how do you control that? And Governor Corbett has been pretty much inviting in potential gas drillers and giving them free rein. And a lot of people in Pennsylvania are saying, no, this isn't right. We need to watch out for our water sources. We need to watch out for our waters that go through all of our neighborhoods. We have to watch out for potential gas leaks. All of these issues prove to be an impediment to free business practices, but it's about protecting human life and our right to health and pursuit of happiness. The other thing that George W. Bush did is he dismissed federal prosecutors who pursued crimes against white-collar criminals. So his whole agenda was based on making it as easy as possible to do business in the United States. Recently, in the last couple years, we've seen some social action against white-collar crime. And this was a grassroots movement, and what grassroots means is it starts at the bottom. There's no one by the name of Bill Gates or President Obama or any major player in the world like Oprah, Angela Merkel from Germany, or even somebody like Kofi Annan, who used to run the UN, saying these things. This is actually coming from the bottom, from the people in the streets. And these people are very upset about how the distribution of income in this country has been aligned so that the vast majority of money in this country is going to the top 1%. You've often heard the term the 1% versus the 99%. So anyway, this organization called Occupy Wall Street was very focused on pursuing white-collar crime. Occupy Wall Street emerged after 2008 when the banking sector essentially ruined the United States economy and the world economy. They have some great ideas. However, it's not well organized, and they have not really been able to do much because they lack organization. A friend of mine was in Occupy Wall Street in New York, and he said that the biggest problem he saw was that your hardcore organizers, the people who go around to social action sites and help people organize, were not welcomed by Occupy Wall Street. They didn't want an experienced leader. They felt that they had enough knowledge to lead themselves. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which way you look at it, they have not made as much of a impact as they had hoped. So let's talk about the 2008 worldwide financial meltdown. In 2008, the economy literally went into the toilet. And around September, October, it turns out that a significant problem was based on fraudulent securities that were sold to investors, and it brought the stock markets to its knees. Although our economy was seriously damaged by the actions of these bankers, no one was punished. And we're going to be looking at this in much more detail when we get specifically into the corporate crime and some of the elements with regulation that allowed this kind of crime to exist. In a nutshell, what these people were doing was basically giving a mortgage to anyone with a heartbeat. If you had a pulse, you could get a mortgage. Now, you have the mortgage. What do you have to do with that mortgage? You have to pay it. So that's the one side with, if you're thinking about the consumer. The bank itself, what they were doing with these mortgages, they were bundling them into securities, and that's basically like a mutual fund, and they were selling them to consumers. These consumers were buying what they thought were pretty safe, i.e. very little risk securities, but what they actually were buying was junk, literally junk. Because if you give someone a $200,000 mortgage and they make $12 a week, how are they ever going to pay the $2,000 a month in mortgage payments they have to come up with? And this was exactly the issue. So the bankers had relaxed all of the laws and ideas that they held as being vital to running a mortgage company and just threw them out the window and passed along the debt to the U.S. public, who then ended up losing all their money when people lost the ability to maintain their mortgage. Another thing that we're going to discuss in a lot more detail, especially in this slideshow, are the concept of informants. And that picture, by the way, is Matt Damon from the movie The Informant. So that's not a real person. Well, Matt Damon is a real person, but not a real informant. These are people who provide the criminal justice system with information that can lead to the investigation, arrest, and conviction of a white-collar criminal. Informants are often low-level employees who are part of the crime. They will often provide the information in exchange for money or for an arrangement concerning criminal charges against them. Now, this is Matt Damon, the actor, and in a few slides I'm going to show you what the real guy looked like who Matt Damon was playing. But informants in the corporate sector, the white-collar sector, are essentially doing it, informing, because they've been involved in the crime themselves, and they're trying to get out of it. The other side of the coin are whistleblowers. These people function similarly to informants, except they are generally not implicated in the crime. The characteristics of a whistleblower are conservative, politically, socially. They're dedicated to their jobs. They're committed to a code of ethics. In other words, they have a really strong sense of what is right and what is wrong. They tend to be female. Women have a much harder time committing crimes than men do, which, if you look at how many prisons there are in this country that are exclusively devoted to women, you'll see that it's not a very large number. These whistleblowers also tend to have good access to information. They tend to be relatively autonomous, and what that means is that they are independent. They don't have a boss who is breathing down their neck all day. Lastly, they tend to be very savvy in terms of technology. They understand how technology works, and more importantly, they also understand how to get information. One of the biggest whistleblowing cases involved WorldCom, which again we're going to look at in more detail later in the semester. Cynthia Cooper was the vice president of internal audits, which means she was pretty high up there. And she blew the whistle on a $3.8 billion fraud. That's a lot of money. Now, whistleblowing is pretty rare. And it tends to be rare because it works against a person's self-interest. Because if they inform investigators about a crime, the company may end up shutting down and the person is out of a job. So someone who has clawed and scratched their way to a good job is oftentimes reluctant to just walk away from that job. They may never make the same kind of money, and if it gets out that they were the ones who did the whistleblowing, a lot of companies won't hire them, thinking that they are in fact a rat, as is often called the informants that are out on the street. Other reasons why there are not more whistleblowers. First, social ostracism. A lot of companies and a lot of industries are very small. So, for example, take teaching. I know a lot of teachers, and as such, if they found out that I was selling grades, which I'm not, unless you have $100,000 and then we can talk. Just kidding. But if my coworkers or the teachers that I knew found out that I was selling grades, that could potentially lead to them never speaking to me again, otherwise known as social ostracism. Other issues include being loyal to the organization. A lot of people will start working at an organization when they're in their 20s and stick around for 10 or 20 years, and they don't want to walk away from that. Then there's the belief that the people running the company know best. This is exactly what was going on with Enron, the big electrical company out in Texas that I was telling you guys about. People felt that the president and the CEO and all of these high-ranking individuals knew what was best, even if they had a feeling that it wasn't going as well as it should. Then there's the fear for safety. One of the big issues that a lot of whistleblowers and informants have dealt with in their life is being threatened. And not only threatened by the people they work with, but their family members being threatened. And that's a pretty scary proposition for a lot of people. And then, lastly, belief that their concerns are unwarranted. A lot of us look and say, I don't think it's that bad. Well, again, what we're looking at when we're looking at white-collar crime is whether it's small or large, it does matter, because what you're losing is money. And that money, somebody trusted that company with. Now, here's the picture of Mark Whitaker, and he blew the whistle about price fixing at Archer Daniels Midland. At the time, he served as president of their bioproducts division, and he had received immunity but lost it when it was discovered he engaged in a almost $10 million fraud. This is the person that Matt Damon played in the movie The Informant. And in this particular case, Mark Whitaker, as I was saying, president of one of their divisions, blew the whistle on the situation of what was going on with his other fellow corporate officers in terms of fixing the prices, and he could have walked away. He could have easily walked away. However, when push came to shove, it was discovered that he had embezzled his own $10 million. So, these whistleblowers / informants are not always the most honest. In 2002, two studies, one by a researcher named Johnson and another one by Nussbaum, showed that 50% of whistleblowers face retaliation, which include isolating the employee, harassment, career-killing transfers, demotions, termination, and lawsuits. 50%, that's half. That is a lot of people who could be potentially able to blow the whistle on some high-level fraud, but who just don't want to because they know it could ruin their career. Second bullet, 10 to 20% deal with serious personal ramifications. Divorce, suicide, loss of home. If you go from making $500,000 a year down to nothing, you are going to have a much different home life than if you just kept your mouth shut. Now, in 1986, the False Claims Amendment Act was passed. And this is a law that offers whistleblowers, not informants, whistleblowers, a money reward after a successful prosecution when the information reported is about the American government and taxpayers being defrauded by a private company. So, if a private company is out to defraud taxpayers, that's when this will kick in. But if it is a private company who are just defrauding private people, not through the government, not through a government agency, then you don't get any money. So, the example that I'm giving you is that in Jerry H. Brown II was a shipping industry insider, and he blew the whistle to the U.S. government about the shipping company Maersk. Maersk is huge. If you look out to the Philadelphia shipyard, you'll see a dozen ships with Maersk on them. Maersk was overcharging for shipments to U.S. forces fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. In a settlement announced on the 3rd of January 2012, 2 years ago, the company agreed to pay $31.9 million in fines and interest, but made no admission of wrongdoing. In other words, nolo contendere. They weren't going to fight the charge. They were going to pay their fine, but they're not accepting guilt. Jerry H. Brown II was entitled to $3.6 million of that settlement. So just by blowing the whistle, he was able to collect a nice little payday. The government has a much bigger pocket for providing informants with any kind of cash payment for doing this. Whereas, private companies, there's no incentive for them to offer a cash settlement for people to inform on them. So let's talk about journalists and news and the media, because for most of us, we get our news through either the television, the radio, the internet. Most of us are not reading newspapers anymore. But at the beginning of the 20th century, newspapers was the only way to get news. So, starting with this slide, over the course of the 20th century, investigative reporting has been one of the ways that white-collar crime has been uncovered. The Jungle. In 1906, Upton Sinclair's book The Jungle was published. It detailed the practices in the meatpacking plants of Chicago. I'm going to be sending you a short excerpt from this book just so you can see what people were reading, because it was so revolting that people demanded the government intervene and develop food laws to protect the food sources. I had mentioned in class last week that there were instances where people's body parts got stuck in the grinders, and rather than stopping the machinery, they just pulled the person away, and then whatever body part the machine had ground up stayed in the meat. So people were eating all kinds of crazy stuff. They were adding chemicals to rotten meat so that it wouldn't smell rotten. It was a pretty disgusting explanation of what was going on in these meatpacking plants. Over the years, you had other journalists crusading, and especially in the first 15 years of the 20th century. Child labor abuses, political scandals, corporate corruption, and exploitation of the poor. These reporters were called muckrakers because they were looking into the dirty practices of business. World War I started in 1914, but it really didn't hit the U.S. till a couple years after. But the focus of the public changed to reflect the concerns about the war. And World War I was terrible. And we're going to talk about World War I a little bit more, but World War I was just a terrible, terrible war, probably the worst war on record of the 20th century, way worse than World War II in terms of the number of people who died. But ultimately, what is the lesson? We get easily distracted. Ooh, look, a butterfly. Every day, we can turn on the news, and there's probably 10 good minutes of news, and then we get our update about Justin Bieber or Lindsay Lohan or the Kardashians, and then they throw in some fluff, and then we find out we're getting another 6 inches of snow, and that's pretty much the news that most of us watch. If you want solid, good news, you got to go online and read a good news source. You can go on CNN, you can go on BBC America, which I prefer. There are good sources out there. Now, that's not to say that all the sources are good that's on the internet. You have to make sure you're reading something that attempts to follow a non-partisan perspective. So, for example, Fox News is overtly conservative and MSNBC is overtly liberal. So really, watching that is only going to give you perspective on one side. You want to try and find a news source that's going to give you both sides. Investigative journalism today. There are some outlets that continue to perform investigative journalism, but it's not that significant in the news world. Back in the day, everybody watched 60 Minutes. Now I don't know anybody who does. But magazines like Mother Jones, New York Times, Washington Post, they still pursue it, but it's not the moneymaker that it used to be. Also, most of our local news, like 6ABC, Action News, or NBC, they tend to focus more on consumer fraud than they do on any kind of investigative journalism. So when you call up and you say that Philadelphia Parking Authority is ticketing mopeds, then CBS News gets a hold of that and they go knock on doors and they find out that they shouldn't be ticketing mopeds, and that all hits the news, and then we move on to the next Justin Bieber update. So, what does our daily news focus on? Well, the first 10 minutes of most news is about the violent crimes. You very rarely see much about white-collar crimes, which then leads us to believe that we have a bigger problem in this country with violent crime than white-collar crime. And the fact of the matter is that it's not. White-collar crime costs much more money than street crime ever will. So why are we not seeing white-collar crime on the news? Well, it doesn't inspire passion. You know, when we see a kid run over by a school bus, and this happened about a month ago, oh, such a sad moment. You have the family crying, you have the bus standing off to the side, you see, little teddy bears and flowers being set up near the bus stop. We, as the public, watch this and it pulls on our heartstrings. Whereas, we find out some old white guy embezzled a couple $1,000,000 and oh well, it's not surprising and it's not sexy and it's not violent. So that stuff is usually in the middle of the newscast and only briefly ever discussed. Also, the crimes themselves tend to be complicated and hard to understand by the average person. Most Americans are not financially literate. So when we start talking about embezzling billions of dollars by, setting up shell corporations, most people start to tune out once they hear something like a shell corporation because they don't know what that means. And a shell corporation is basically a fake corporation that's been set up to launder money or to do some sort of business exchange. It's not always illegal, but they're there for a particular reason. Also, and this is a very important element, is that corporations have lawyers on staff who spend their time threatening to sue people who speak out against them, especially and definitely including the news media. If you have a big company like Facebook or Google and, Diane Sawyer on ABC News is going to reveal some, tricky maneuvering done by one of these companies, their lawyers are going to be sending out a dozen letters every 20 minutes trying to get people to stop. More so than that is think about it from the perspective of who owns the news media. ABC is owned by the Disney Corporation. Can you imagine ABC News doing an expose on something that Disney may have done? Of course not. It's going to get kiboshed. So a lot of times this stuff gets buried, not just because people are not interested, not just because people are not familiar with the terms, but you're also dealing with the actual owners of these news media outlets. And then we get into another conflict of interest. Corporations are the people who buy advertising time during the news hours. And if they withdraw their business, the entire channel will suffer financially. So, for example, let's go back to my example about Disney and ABC News. So Diane Sawyer is going to reveal that instead of selling giant turkey legs at Disney World, they're actually peacock legs, which, by the way, is not true, but I'm making it up for my example. At this point, Disney is not only going to step in and sue, but they're going to withdraw any advertising for any news source that is related to ABC News. So it just doesn't make any sense for these companies to bite the hand that feeds them. Another element here is white-collar criminal trials are dull and dry. There is very little gasp-inducing moments. That is the standard fare for most murder trials that are televised. Whether it's Jodi Arias or you go 20 years ago to O.J. Simpson, these criminal trials are there for the moments, for those moments that we all go, oh my God. And the reality is that, when you're dealing with white-collar criminals in accounting, it's not very gasp-inducing. It's not exciting. It's not sexy.